Putin knows how to play Trump. Both of them ultimately realise that they're not quite what they make themselves out to be, and they can both in some ways reinforce each other's delusion and hype. Who said, look, this is our worst nightmare. An American president who has a relatively low threshold for the use of force, who changes his mind quite literally overnight, who doesn't consult with his allies, let alone warn his antagonists in advance. So, there was always this sense that with Trump, you're dealing with a semi-house-trained, but very powerful rival president. He does not want to go down in history as the Tsar who lost Ukraine. So I think here we have a man who thinks much more about power, much more about security of the Russian Federation, and his own personal security. An autocrat who is toppled might find himself hanging from a lamppost in Red Square. This is one of the interesting things if one thinks about the relationship between Putin and Trump, is if you believe what Trump says, they have a long, full relationship, they have met, they have got on and so forth. If you believe what Putin's spokesman, Putin's official calendar, and every single objective record that we've got, the fact of the matter is they have had minimal contact until Trump was president. Because after all, that is what, from Putin's point of view, is interesting and important about Trump. It's the fact that he was, and is again, the American president. Just some taste-challenged American real estate wannabe magnate. That's not the kind of thing that otherwise would interest Putin at all. Psychoanalyzing the whole relationship between Trump and Putin from Trump's point of view is obviously a difficult one, because in some ways it does involve crawling into the recesses of Trump's brain, but also trying to assess his ego. And the bottom line is this: in many ways, I think Trump is a wannabe strongman. He looks at these figures like Putin, but not exclusively Putin. I mean, let's be honest, Trump doesn't seem to have met an autocrat that he doesn't like. He likes the sense of being one of this elite club of strongmen who don't have to worry about courts and laws and oppositions, who essentially can get up one morning and change the world. I think that's very much how he sees himself, and why he tries to align himself with these people. Now, some of these strongmen, it's difficult because of geopolitical reasons. China's Xi Jinping is the obvious case, because you may want to align yourself with Xi, but there's no way of getting around the fact that at the moment China is the most obvious geopolitical counterbalance to the United States. Russia, though, Russia is a particularly interesting case from the Americans' point of view, because when it comes down to it, despite the terrible things it's doing in Ukraine, and despite fears that it could at some point pose some kind of a threat to Europe, fears that are probably overblown, but it doesn't really pose a threat to America in the terms that Trump thinks. Remember, Trump thinks of the presidency not as a statesman speaking for his people, but essentially as the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated. He sees everything in terms of balance sheets and such like. And in those terms, Russia is not a threat. So in that respect, Putin, even were he not actually quite a capable manipulator of Trump, but nonetheless, he would also appeal to Donald Trump, in my opinion, because he embodies those kinds of values that Trump would like to embody himself and thinks of himself as embodying, without actually being a potential risk. I would be very, very surprised, of course, if Putin had anything like the same degree of esteem for Trump. Trump, now, okay, we have to be careful with Trump in that he says a lot of things that may well change tomorrow or whenever the wind changes on the moon or whatever else. Putin has been much more, I think it's fair to say, consistent in how he addresses Donald Trump. Sometimes actually with a slight little tweak of condescension. On the one hand, he says good things about Trump, but primarily he says positive things about Trump because Trump is more favorable towards Russia, or at least more unfavorable to Russia's antagonists and enemies. But even then, I think there's that little edge. At one point, for example, he uses this word yarky, which can be translated as bright. And clearly that's how Trump took it, that, oh, Putin said I was very bright, very smart. Actually, it really means colourful. And it's the kind of word you use, it's a little bit like the way the English use the word interesting, often to mean something that they really don't like. Well, likewise, in this case, Putin was actually being a bit snarky there. So I think this is the situation. Putin knows how to play Trump. And part of that is to show respect. That's very important for Trump, to feel that existing and established world leaders respect him. It's to say the right things, provide the right sound bites, because again, it's all very well producing a 5-page encomium. What Trump wants is something that can fit on an X tweet. So essentially, the impression I get, and of course it can only be an impression, is essentially that Putin doesn't have at all a great respect for Trump, but certainly finds him exceedingly useful. I think one could almost call the relationship between these two men something of an on-again, off-again bromance. For two reasons. To deal with the on and off element, I mean, there are clearly times in which actually Trump has acted in ways that have been against Putin's interests. For example, particularly sort of famously or infamously, there was a point in his first presidency at the time when the Russians were all in on the phenomenally brutal Assad regime in Syria. They were very much sort of supporting Assad and his regime in Damascus. And at one point, this regime used chemical weapons, well, several times, but certainly there's one particular case where they used chemical weapons against civilian targets. And literally in a matter of hours, Trump, who had said that he wasn't going to intervene, presumably because he saw the footage of civilians, particularly civilian children, who had been affected by these chemical weapons, actually reversed his position and launched cruise missile attacks against the regime. And it's interesting because I was actually in Moscow shortly thereafter and was talking to a foreign ministry staffer there who said, look, this is our worst nightmare. An American president who has a relatively low threshold for the use of force, who changes his mind quite literally overnight, who doesn't consult with his allies, let alone warn his antagonists in advance. So, there was always this sense that with Trump, you're dealing with a semi-house-trained, but very powerful rival president. But most of the time, clearly, it's been a very positive relationship. And even when we see these little outbursts, for example, when Trump saying he was wondering recently whether or not Putin was just sort of stringing him along over peace negotiations, in the past at least, and things could change, but in the past, they have actually very quickly subsided. But bromance, I mean, it's a sort of light-hearted way of describing this relationship, but nonetheless, it does capture this sense that it is about alpha males, or maybe more to the point, wannabe alpha males, because actually both of them are right. This is one of the reasons why actually the two men can connect. There's clearly similarities in their views of the world, how they think geopolitics works and so forth. But it is also the fact that in their own ways, these are not the kind of red-blooded superheroes that they might like to make out. I mean, Putin, for all his propensity for waging wars, and the fact that he can scarcely walk past a tank or a jet fighter without a photo opportunity in the cockpit, but has not had any meaningful military experience. He was a KGB officer, a member of the Soviet secret police. But even then, he was fairly mediocre. We know from his records, some of which ended up leaking. So, he was not this subtle master spy that is sometimes projected. Likewise, Donald Trump, got out of military service. His idea of active service would seem to be golf. So, I mean, in this context, both of them like to elevate themselves. Both of them are in that sort of camp of wannabes. And that's why I think that they also do kind of connect in some ways on a personal level, beyond the practicalities and the manipulations and so forth. It's because, both of them ultimately realize that they're not quite what they make themselves out to be. And they can both, in some ways, reinforce each other's delusion and hype. However cozy the two men seem to be at times, it is clear that there are reasons why they would actually find each other potentially problematic. I mean, from Trump's point of view, the issue is, after all, that Putin ultimately clearly has his own agenda. And his own agenda is not necessarily the one that he either articulates to Trump or that is in Trump's interests. And we've seen this most clearly in Ukraine. And I think this is why Ukraine may be the issue that really leads to a serious bust-up between these two men. Because Trump had laid himself out as someone who was going to end this war, I mean, originally in just 24 hours, and then it was in a few months and whatever. But it is clear that, in fact, he's not going to magically bring this nasty internecine conflict to an end. So I think it is that sense that, from his point of view, he is aware that Putin has too many other irons in the fire. And one of those clearly is China. And this is the thing. Trump seems to have decided that it's this kind of civilizational and economic struggle with China that is going to be absolutely crucial, that is going to define his presidency. And we see this in everything from defense policy all the way through to clearly the infamous tariffs. But on the other hand, Putin needs China. I mean, it is clear that China is at the moment increasingly, frankly, a dominant force in Russia, whether it's the fact of, well, the majority of new cars you see on the streets of Moscow are Chinese brands that we don't even see in the West, all the way through to the fact that China provides a route whereby goods can be smuggled into Russia in breach of sanctions and the like. So, in this respect, there's no way that Putin can be on Trump's team. For the Russians, of course, it's actually the question of unpredictability, particularly because they got used to the United States being the grown-up party, the one who would always try and bring some degree of stability to a situation, which meant that the Russians could very carefully and tactically and performatively, but nonetheless play the role of the unpredictable wild man. That they could do all the sort of things that would breach the rules, whether it's trying to poison Sergei Skripal in Britain, or whether it's supporting regimes like Assad's, or whether it's sending their bombers skirting into the airspace of NATO countries. Not actually that they were ever going to, for example, launch an attack on NATO countries, but it was that way to try and say, oh, we're dangerous, we're unpredictable, we are so problematic that you want to buy us off. But of course, who is going to out-unpredictable Donald Trump? So the irony is we now actually find that it's the Russians who are often trying to say, well, let's think about this carefully. We can't rush into anything. There needs to be discussions, precisely because now you have a deeply unpredictable American president with all the phenomenal resources of the world's only hyperpower, in front of which, yes, Russia has nuclear arsenal capable of destroying the world, but that's about it. And if that's the only card in your hand, you really don't want to get into a game. One of the areas in which Trump and Putin are actually very different is how they look at power, how they look at their own roles. As I mentioned, Trump very much is still a businessman. He sees things in terms of deals and portfolios and such like. And yes, now that he is president of the United States, it is almost as if he feels as if he himself is now CEO of the whole country. Putin does not really think in those kind of terms. I mean, let me be clear. It is not that Putin doesn't think about property and the like. He has all sorts of palaces. But even then, these are not things that he owns. These are things that he has because of his political position. The palaces, the cars, the planes, all the perks of his position are precisely that. They're linked to his position. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's increasingly difficult to imagine that he would give up the Russian presidency, because so much of the kind of the life that the very luxurious life that he enjoys is actually tied up with the job instead of anything else. And I think that also extends to how Putin looks at, for example, Ukraine. He looks at Ukraine in terms of Russia's place in the world, that he fears that if Ukraine was free, it could, in theory, one day, if not join NATO, but nonetheless, be a base for foreign troops and the like. Even though Ukraine says it has no such plans, but, on the whole, Putin is quite paranoid when it comes to the security of the Russian Federation. But he also sees it in terms of legacy. This is a man whom we know is obsessed with this idea of how future generations will think about him. It's a man who not only draws constantly parallels between himself and various historical figures, always from the greats of the Russian state-building pantheon. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Pyotr Stolypin, who was one of the reforming prime ministers of the early 20th century, people like that. So I think from his point of view, he wants to line himself up to become a new Vladimir the Great. And Ukraine is crucial to that. As far as he's concerned, Ukraine, or certainly at the very least eastern Ukraine, is part of Russia that the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin unfairly ripped from Russia after the 1917 revolution. And obviously Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, that's absolutely necessary for Russia. And so I think that a crucial element for him is he does not want to go down in history as the Tsar who lost Ukraine. So I think here we have a man who thinks much more about power, much more about security of the Russian Federation, and his own personal security. Remember, if you're an autocrat, you are vastly more powerful than most elected leaders. But on the whole, if an elected leader loses an election, they can retire, they can go and write their memoirs, they can go and earn the big bucks on the international speaking circuit. An autocrat who is toppled might find himself hanging from a lamppost in Red Square. So I think, from his point of view, there's a much sharper sense of why this matters. So for one man, it's about profit and ego. For another man, it's about ego and survival and power. Of course, look, there's no way we can talk about the Trump-Putin relationship without addressing all these wonderful and lurid stories about compromat, compromising information, about shadowy investments, and essentially this notion that Trump himself is a bought and paid for Russian asset. Now, I can understand why people like this idea. Firstly, because it is much more entertaining. And secondly, because it provides some kind of lens to try and explain why Trump is the way he is. However, I really do think it misses the point. If we talk about the sort of early periods when Trump had visited Russia, of course he would have been under observation. I mean, this is a large paranoid security apparatus that Russia has got. And any rich and important person, and even, frankly, non-rich, non-important people, like I know from my own experiences, may well come under observation when they're in Moscow, in Russia. However, if we look at the property investments, these are periods when there was no real sense that Trump was likely to become a political figure, let alone a president of the United States. I mean, it was a joke, a punchline, the thought of a President Trump. On the whole, it was more that this was a time in which all sorts of frankly dodgy Russians, I feel I need to sort of cover myself by saying, though, not all the investors in various Trump projects were necessarily dodgy, but anyway, there were a lot of dodgy Russians who were looking to desperately move their money out of Russia, essentially to secure it, just in case things change. There's always this constant fear, what happens if? What happens if the communists come back, the nationalists come to power, there's a coup or whatever? So you want to internationalize your money. And also, I mean, from a very subjective perspective, I imagine that the kind of properties that Trump likes, the gilded, the glitzy, the over-the-top, also very much fits in with the aesthetic of the new Russian millionaires and billionaires. I mean, when one looks at these phenomenally tacky, huge mansions that have been built on the outskirts of Moscow, for example, one could easily imagine them transposed into Florida or similar. So I think that there is also a kind of a natural, almost aesthetic connection. And finally, there was the fact that precisely because many Trump economic projects seem to have been, I would hesitate to use the word pyramid scheme, but let's say that they were very much dependent on a constant churn of people coming in, buying, selling, moving on, etc. There has been certainly the suggestion that the Trump organization was less than especially rigorous in vetting the money that came in. So if you're a dodgy Russian with dodgy money, not too overt. I mean, you can't turn up with a sort of a suitcase of cash that's still sort of smudged with Afghan heroin or something. But nonetheless, even if you just done the sort of the most basic of laundering, you wouldn't get through the kind of know your customer requirements that a lot of, shall we say, rather more straight and narrow property companies in the UK or the United States would accept. But Trump was happy to take your money. So I think this was just in some ways almost sort of a natural confluence rather than anything else. But of course, when we come to the first of his elections, absolutely, of course, the Russians were supporting him. But what we have to remember is they were supporting all kinds of different candidates and movements, left and right. Because at this point, their big fear was that Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. In fact, they reckoned that Hillary Clinton essentially had a lock on the election. Again, a quote from a Russian foreign ministry staffer shortly before the election, who airily assured me that the American establishment would not let a Trump win the election. It's classic mirror imaging. The Russians are so often regard Western democracies as much more like theirs. So shall we say, rather more managed than they really are. So they were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And remember, Hillary Clinton is the woman they believe was behind major protests in Moscow in 2011, 2012, the so-called Bolotnaya protests, which were actually a natural and organic protest by Russians, especially, but not exclusively, middle-class Russians, who were annoyed about the corruption of the system, the corruption of the political system, and the fact that Putin was returning to the presidency after 4 years, technically as prime minister. But Putin himself blamed Hillary Clinton, said that basically she gave the order, and the CIA's agents and all these other nefarious people inside Russia generated these protests. So they thought there was someone who was going to be a real threat to them, who was going to win the election. So what they were trying to do was essentially set fires so that, particularly in this all-important first 100 days, a new President Hillary Clinton would be too busy putting out these fires to be able to kind of build together the political coalition and consensus for some kind of basically, anti-state campaign in Russia, regime change in Moscow. So yes, they were supporting Donald Trump because he was a populist and divisive figure. But we also know that there was support for kind of extreme elements of, the National Rifle Association. We also know that there was support for people who were behind Bernie Sanders, the relatively extremely left-wing candidate within the Democrat Party. They were just basically trying to back anyone who they thought was going to be a problem. And then they were taken aback, frankly, when Trump was elected. They didn't know what he stood for. They didn't know how to talk to him. So in this context, Trump for them was a spoiler rather than an agent. And look, this is not a decisive factor, but I can't help but feel that if I was sitting in one of the various Russian intelligence agency headquarters, Foreign Intelligence Service out at Yasenevo in the suburbs, let's say, and I was the agent handler for Agent Orange, our agent in the White House, if nothing else, I'd have been telling him, tone down all this praise of Putin. Because in fact, that made it a lot harder for Trump to do anything that was favourable to Russia. If we look at the end of the first Trump presidency, by the end of that presidency, American policy towards Russia was tougher than it had been at any point since the end of the Cold War. And the reason for that is essentially that Congress had taken over policy towards Russia. And Trump, who is first and foremost interested in Trump, was not willing to spend political capital trying to kind of wrench it back. So it's precisely because Trump's weirdly outspoken fanboyishness of Putin had so alarmed the American political establishment within the Republican as well as Democrat Party that actually American policy hardened so sharply towards Russia during that first presidency. So all of this suggests that if Trump was a Russian agent, and let's be honest, how much investigative journalistic capability, intelligence activity and so forth has been directed against trying to prove this, and so far without success. If Trump was, then on the one hand, the Russians have pulled off the most astonishing intelligence coup of the 21st and indeed 20th centuries in getting their man in the White House. But at the same time, they have massively failed to take advantage of that. I think we just have to accept that Trump is a wrecking ball. Yes, it's useful for Russia when the wrecking ball is swinging against NATO or other institutions that block Russian interests. But the Russians always have this very uncomfortable awareness that if for any reason the wrecking ball started to swing their way, actually Trump would be a lot more dangerous for them than a much more moderate, reasonable candidate like Joe Biden. Of course, whenever we talk about the Trump-Putin relationship, there is always the shadow of the Steele dossier, and its more racy claims about dubious activities with prostitutes in Moscow hotel rooms and the like. First of all, it's worth noting that the Steele dossier as such was never actually meant to be released. It was actually itself described as raw intelligence, which is, in other words, this is stuff that we've been told, not stuff that we've had a chance to verify. And particularly when it comes to someone like Donald Trump, you're going to hear a lot of extreme and lurid stories. Everyone has an opinion on Trump. Secondly, in some ways, there is a bizarre way in which Donald Trump is, I wouldn't quite say scandal-proof, but nonetheless, he's one of those politicians, and we see them around in its own way. I mean, Boris Johnson was something like that. That I think the phrase is that it's already priced in. You know, everyone expects Donald Trump to do extraordinary and quite possibly distasteful things, and that doesn't necessarily shock people. So it would be interesting to know whether or not this compromising material is actually really would have been that useful, even if it had existed. But thirdly, and most crucially, I mean, there is the basic point that Donald Trump has not really acted as we would expect a Russian asset to act. And particularly now, just as during his first presidency, this is a man cradled by arguably the most capacious and capable Secret Service in the world. If you're a Russian handler, how do you get your instructions to Donald Trump when everything in the White House and elsewhere is surveilled? When there are always men and women in dark suits and sunglasses lurking in the eaves? You know, I think, after a certain point, we have to realize that life is not necessarily a film, and that, in fact, fun accounts that would seem to take what is actually a very complex situation. The interaction between these two, in some ways similar, in other ways very, very different figures, and generally what sort of a worldview Trump represents. And to simplify it down to, oh, he's a Russian spy, we knew it all along. That's appealing because we all like simple answers. And also, particularly if you don't like Trump, you want to have an answer that discredits him. In fact, in many ways, Trump is really just simply a product of not just the post-Cold War world, but the end of the order that the Cold War in its own way represented. You know, we do now live in an age where we seem to be swinging back towards populist politics at home and much more raw-knuckled international relations where, countries and blocs are pushing their own interests. In that respect, Trump is, in his own, I would say, rather ghastly way, a reflection of our times, not someone whom we can read from a dossier is being, just simply puppeteered by nasty Russians.